Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to block your knitted or crocheted projects. So first of all, let's talk about what is blocking. So blocking is something that we do to knitted or crocheted items, and it helps the fabric, whether it be knit or crochet, it helps the fabric to kind of become more pliable and more drapey, and it also kind of helps it lay the way it's going to lay after it's been washed. So what I've got here is I've got two different swatches, and I'm going to show you a couple different methods of blocking today. So blocking is sometimes considered almost synonymous with washing. Now I'll explain that a little bit more in a second when we get to this swatch over here. But when you finish a project, the way it looks right after you're finished with it is not going to be the way it looks after you wash the item and begin to use it. So regardless of what your fiber content is, blocking will help the fabric to relax a little bit. It will help it to lay more nicely and have better drape. And blocking also, especially if your knit or crochet fabric is kind of scrunched up, blocking will help it smooth out and relax and lay flat, in the sense that, if this is all kind of crumpled or tight, or like this right here where it just kind of curls like that, blocking will help with that. And you do want to keep in mind that when you knit a project, this is going to have to be something I'm going to talk about in a different video, but when you knit a project, if you're going by the gauge measurements given in your pattern, most of the time, unless the pattern says to measure your gauge unblocked, which doesn't happen very often, most of the time when they tell you how many stitches you should have per inch or how many stitches you should have in 4 inches or whatever, that is usually referencing, the size of those stitches after blocking. Because once you block the fabric, it kind of gets into its final shape. And if you measure the gauge before you block your swatch, then chances are when you block the actual finished product, it's going to be usually bigger, a little bit bigger than what it's supposed to be, because the blocking helps the fabric kind of relax and spread out to where it's going to lay naturally after it's been washed. So you wouldn't want to measure your gauge before you block your gauge swatch, because then that's not going to be what the actual finished gauge of the project is after it's been washed and you go to wear it or use it or whatever. So in most cases, blocking will not drastically affect the size of your piece. It will affect it a little bit. Like for example, when I block this, this will probably kind of spread out a little bit more and get slightly larger. But it's not going to be as drastic as if this were some kind of really open lace, whether it be knit or crochet. Sometimes lace, really open lace, tends to be all kind of scrunched up and wadded up when you're working on it, and then when you block it, it spreads out and smooths out, and it ends up being larger than it is when it's all crumpled up. So I've got kind of two separate blocking setups here that I'm going to show you, and that's because there are different ways of blocking your item, and that can depend on the type of fiber that your yarn is made of. So I'm going to be kind of comparing how we would do this for synthetic fiber like acrylic versus a natural fiber like some sort of wool or alpaca or animal hair of some kind. Cotton as well works the same way. But generally for acrylic, I prefer steam blocking, and I'll explain what that is in a minute. But for any kind of natural fiber, or an instance where the majority of the fiber content is natural fiber, then I will go ahead and use either spray blocking or wet blocking. Now, regardless, this is going to be involving getting the fabric wet. Now, if your wool or animal fiber is not superwash, meaning it's not treated with silicones so that it won't felt, then you have to be careful when you block it to not be like kind of scrubbing it up against each other and agitating it when it's wet, because that will cause the fabric to felt, and you don't want that to happen. But as long as you're not agitating the fabric, getting it wet is not going to hurt anything when you have to get it wet to block it. So if your yarn is machine washable, you can also throw it in the washing machine and then dry it, or let it dry naturally, or whatever. That works okay as well. But generally, I'm either working with acrylics or non-superwash animal fibers. Occasionally when I do use superwash, I still block it this way as opposed to throwing it in the washing machine, because I just prefer to do it by hand. So first I'm going to show you what I would do for an acrylic or a synthetic fiber. So this black and white fabric right here, this is a pressing board. And this is basically a piece of wood that's covered with batting and pretty decent quality, like thicker cotton fabric, or like a canvas. And I bought this on Etsy. I will go ahead and put a link in the description box below. But I love this for blocking anything kind of small. Mine is about 18 by 15. And this is a great replacement for an ironing board if you're blocking something small. But if you're blocking a larger project, you're going to want to do this on an ironing board. If I'm doing something small, I generally like to do it on the pressing board because it's dense and hard. And an ironing board is generally, even though it's metal underneath, there's like little holes in the metal, and it's just not as sturdy as my pressing board. So I use this for sewing and pressing and stuff like that. But I also like to use it for blocking small synthetic or acrylic crochet or knitted items, especially motifs like small granny squares, little hexagons, whatever you're making. I like to do those on here. And for steam blocking, that is basically just what it sounds like. We're steaming the fabric to get it to relax. We kind of smooth it out, and it calms down the fabric and brings it a little bit more drape and fluid, a fluidity to the fabric. So I use an iron for this, a steam iron. If you have a garment steamer, like one of those handheld garment steamers, that works as well. So basically what I would do here is I would lay this out on my pressing board, and then I would put some water in my iron and turn it on the steam function. And I'm not going to really do this on camera because it would steam up my lens and you wouldn't be able to see it anyway. So with the steaming hot iron, it's not hot right now, but pretend it were steaming hot, I would hover this about 2 or 3 inches over the surface of the fabric and let the steam come out of the iron and penetrate the fabric. And the point of this is to kind of soften and relax the fabric, like I said. But sometimes, especially if I'm blocking motifs, there are times when you want to block all your motifs so that they're exactly the same size. So if I were to be needing this blocked to a certain size, then I would measure out how big it needs to be blocked to. And then I would take these little rust-proof T-pins. And they do need to be rust-proof because they're going to be in moisture, like the steam. So here's what one of them looks like. It's kind of T-shaped at the top, and that is so it doesn't just go right through your fabric, because you don't want like one of those little tiny dressmaker pins, unless you have like the flat ones that have like a little plastic leaf on the top or whatever. Otherwise, you don't want sewing pins or dressmaking pins because the head of the pin is too small, and if I were to push that through, If I pin this to my board, my crochet fabric could not slip through or slip over the head of the pin as easily as if this were a like a little ball head pin or one of those little tiny flat-headed dressmaking pins. So if I needed to make sure all my motifs blocked to the same size, I would go ahead and pin this to my board at whatever the correct dimensions would be. And because this is wood, I can't pin straight down into it. So I just kind of pin through the fabric like so. And then I would go ahead and kind of pin the edges straight like that. Now I'm not actually measuring this, and normally you don't want to be stretching your fabric too much when you do this. Because you just don't want it to be stretched out as you block it, because then when you unpin it, it's going to end up smaller because it's going to contract again. So I would kind of go around this and pin it to the board like so. And then I would take my steaming iron and hover it over like this so that all the steam penetrated the crochet or the knitting, to make sure that it's, totally saturated with the steam. It doesn't have to be like wet, but it needs to be warm to the touch after you move the iron out of the way. You want to make sure that that steam gets all over the fabric. So then I would go ahead and unpin the piece from my pressing board. So now I'm going to show you how to block an animal fiber or a natural fiber. And this particular swatch is wool. By the way, this is a gauge swatch that I'm working on for an upcoming pattern, so keep an eye out for that. But for natural fibers, we need to get the fabric wet. And you don't just want it like damp on the surface, you want it totally wet, totally saturated with water. So you can either do this by taking your swatch, dipping it in a bowl of water and making sure that it gets totally saturated, and then kind of blotting it between towels to get the drippiness out of it. But my favorite way to do this is to spray block. So to spray block, I would kind of take this here and smooth it out and go ahead and pin it so that the edges are all straight. By the way, I should mention here that if you're doing like lace knitting where it's really intricate and it's got a lot of detail to the lace blocking usually involves something called blocking wires. And blocking wires, if I understand correctly, I don't actually have any, but I believe blocking wires kind of get woven into the edge of your lace knitting, so that when you go to pin this, that it will help keep the edges straight. But unless you're doing lace knitting with real thin yarn, you don't need those. So I'm going to go ahead and pin this to the blocking mat. Now I should also explain what this is. This is a foam blocking mat. Now this is basically just a sheet of foam that's cut in kind of a puzzle piece shape where they interlock together so that I can connect more of these mats together if I need to block something that's bigger than just this one square. Now, if you don't want to buy blocking mats, you can also get foam exercise mats, because it's basically the same thing with a different description or a different marketing, so to speak, on it, a different label. But foam exercise mats are basically exactly the same as these. And also, I know they make little foam mats that interlock like this for little kids to play on. And those are also basically the same thing as blocking mats. So if you have one of those other versions of the same thing, then you can just use those instead of buying blocking mats. But these, I have the Knit Picks blocking mats, and I actually have 2 sets of them, and I really like them. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin this to the mat, like I said. If this was a bigger project, then I would pin it, pin it out on more mats. And also, like I said about the other swatch, if you're doing this for a finished project, and it says block to finish measurements, then you're going to pin it out so that it is the correct measurements for whatever the pattern says it should be. Now, if you're doing the method where you get the fabric wet first before you pin it out, that's totally fine, and a lot of people do it that way. I just choose to pin it out dry first and then spray it, just because I don't necessarily like having to squeeze or wring or pat the extra drippy water out of it. And with spray blocking, I can still get it pretty saturated without having, as much extra drippiness to the swatch, so to speak. But also, I find that if I get the knitting or the crochet wet first, a lot of times that relaxes the fibers a lot more. And in my personal opinion, I tend to get the fabric stretched out too much if it's wet before I pin it, because the fabric when it's wet is a lot more relaxed, stretches way easier, and I don't want it to be stretched out when I block it. I just want it to lay naturally the way it's going to be when it's being used and worn and washed. So whether you pin it to the mat first or whether you wet it first and then pin it to the mat, it doesn't matter. The point here is that you, at some point or another, get it on the mat and you get it wet, okay? And then we're going to let it dry completely before we check our gauge from our gauge swatch if we're blocking a gauge swatch, or before we use the finished item if you're blocking a finished item. So I'm going to go ahead and take some water in a squirt bottle, and I am going to just spray this all over until it's totally saturated. So now that that's wet all over, I'm just going to kind of pat the water into the fabric. I can feel that it's very, very wet. And just to demonstrate how much stretchier it is when it's wet, I'm going to go ahead and unpin this on the one side and show you how much more relaxed the fabric is and how easy it would be to stretch it too far out of shape if I were to have pinned it after I wet it. And again, that's just my personal preference. You do whatever works best for you, but this just is what works best for me. So now that it's wet, we want this to dry completely. And sometimes especially if it's a big project or if it's something really thick, that can take a really long time. So my tip for that, if you want to speed up the drying time of your blocking, what I like to do is I like to lay my blocking mats upright, like so, up against a wall, a piece of furniture, a dresser, a door, whatever. Lay it upright against something, and then put a little fan on the floor in front of it. And the fan helps accelerate the drying time of your wet knitting or crochet. At least in my experience, I've done that a lot, especially when I am blocking a gauge swatch or something like this, and I really need to get started on the pattern so that I can have it out for the next week's video or whatever. So I will usually lean this up against a door or a wall and then put a little fan on the floor in front of it and just turn the fan on and let it blow directly at the knitting. If it's a bigger project, I might kind of move the fan, after a little while so that it blows directly at a different area. But regardless of how you do it, you just want to make sure that it dries completely before you unpin it from the mat. And once it is completely dry, then when we unpin it, it will be at its kind of most relaxed natural state without being stretched out. So I'm going to show you real quick another swatch, and this one is already blocked. So this is the stitch pattern I'm going to be using for another upcoming design. This is my gauge swatch, and this has already been blocked. So as you can see, especially because this one is lace, the blocking just kind of opens up the fabric, relaxes it, smooths it out, and it just kind of evens out and makes it look its best. As opposed to if I had not blocked this, I should have taken a picture of it before I blocked it, but I forgot. If I had not blocked this, it would be more kind of scrunched up. So maybe I will take a picture of the design I'm going to make from this stitch while it's in progress before it's blocked, so that you can see what this same fabric would look like unblocked and how much more it kind of like bubbles and lumps and, you know, it kind of shrinks up a little bit. Not because we stretched it when we blocked it, but just because we relaxed the fabric and let it come to kind of its natural, its natural lay or its natural drape and all that kind of stuff. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions about blocking, let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.